These cases progresses faster with noticeable hypoxia. Patients are also suffering more serious heart problems than SARS. So we are continually monitoring the vital signs of patients, such as changes of the heart rate, blood pressure, and especially blood oxygen. We are also using invasive ventilators and mechanical lungs to help them. Through these changes, we hope to help critical patients and reduce mortality.
Now, the total number of confirmed cases in China is just under 60,000. The death toll stands at over 1,300, while over 6,000 have recovered. Meanwhile, the number of new confirmed cases in Wuhan jumped to more than 14,000 after Hubei province improved its diagnosis measures by getting results from both clinical diagnosis and lab testing. Guangdong, Zhejiang and Henan provinces are the most affected areas outside Hubei, with each reporting more than 1,000 cases. Beijing has now reported 360 cases and Shanghai over 310. The virus has spread to 24 other countries, which have reported more than 500 cases. Meanwhile, in Japan, authorities have announced the country's first death, while 44 more people aboard the Diamond Princess cruise ship, as well as one quarantine officer, have been confirmed to be infected, raising the ship's total cases to 218. Well, China says it's mobilizing a further 3,000 medical workers from around the country to support Hubei province. They're expected to treat critically ill patients in Wuhan and its neighboring cities. Earlier, CGTN had a chance to speak with some of them at the airport in Wuhan.
Our team has 138 members. 35 of them are doctors. Our doctors mainly specialize in treating respiratory diseases and critically ill patients. We will be in charge of 30 intensive care units. If we meet with difficulties, we also have long-distance support back in Fujian. We will do whatever we can to cure the patients.
Our hospital has established a new treatment center, and we have reinforced by 11 medical teams, involving a total of 1,500 medical staff to help us treat coronavirus patients.
We have a team of 160 people, including 120 nurses and 40 doctors from intensive care, respiratory, infection, and internal medicine departments. We're in charge of a whole inpatient ward. We're well trained and clinically experienced, so I hope we can do our best job and complete the mission well.
We got to Wuhan as fast as we could. We hope to win the battle against the epidemic together with the people of Wuhan and have the virus under control as soon as possible.
Well, Japan has reported its first death from the novel coronavirus. The woman in her 80s was confirmed positive after her death. Meanwhile, Japan's Prime Minister has announced a series of measures to deal with the outbreak. Abe made the announcement as health officials said a further 44 people on a cruise ship quarantined near Tokyo have tested positive for the virus. That vessel now has 218 confirmed cases out of the 713 people tested. It still has around 3,500 passengers and crew on board. Our correspondent Terence Terashima has more from Yokohama.
This actually brings about a debate whether the quarantine in the ship is actually strict enough or adequate to contain the virus from spreading. On Wednesday, they also announced that one quarantine officer be positive with the coronavirus. So there have been a lot of criticism to the Japanese government that in fact this quarantine in the ship is actually working or not. They will prioritize elderly members and those with chronic illness to be tested, as they're more vulnerable, and they can be taken off the ship and their chronic illness to be treated in medical hospital. Those found positive would be quarantined in a medical facility. The 14-day quarantine is due to end on the 19th of February. The question is that with the rapid rise in the number of people found positive with the coronavirus, the question is whether all the remaining passengers and crews to be tested or not. The government said they are considering it, but they have not committed as yet. And one of the reasons is that there's not enough medical facilities that can conduct the test, as well as if and when they found people positive, they're still looking for medical facilities. And also some debate in the government is that because it will take longer than a week to test everyone, whether they have the right to have the passengers remain on the ship indefinitely until the tests.
Well, here in Kenya, China has been taking precautionary measures to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. There are no confirmed cases in Africa to date, but the Chinese ambassador to Kenya said the issue of public health goes beyond national borders and requires a collective effort. He added that the Chinese embassy is monitoring the entry of its nationals into Kenya.
We have required all Chinese nationals coming back from China, whatever they have symptoms or not, to isolate themselves at home for 14 days. Even they don't have any symptoms, they must isolate it. At this difficult time, our Kenya and African friends have given China strong support. We cherish it very, very much. No cases of infection among Kenyans in China has been reported so far. I touched wood again. So I fully understand the concern and fears of families of Kenyans living or studying in China, especially in Wuhan city. I wish to stress that foreign nationals, including Kenyans, are safe in China. Many of the reports offered objective information and reasonable analysis. We appreciate that.
Earlier, we spoke to Rudy Eggers, the World Health Organization's Kenya representative. He touched on the preventative measures African countries can take in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak.
Well, quite correct that currently there's no confirmed case in Africa, but we've of course had several suspected cases. So people that have come back from China, almost all have got some connection to travel to China. And in several African countries, including Kenya, we've had suspected cases. Here in Kenya, we've now had 9 suspected cases that were initially investigated. Some of them were rapidly discarded, but there were 6 or so where we went through the confirmation testing. So what the countries have to do is they have to prepare for the potential importation of cases. So the first step is, of course, making sure that there's screening procedures at the airport. So when people are arriving from flights, from overseas flights, mainly from China, but also really from other international hubs, that these people get screened for the symptoms of coronavirus. So they get screened for fever, and if they're symptomatic of coughing and sneezing and that kind of thing. But there are other things that the country also has to do. They have to keep the public informed. So there's a whole public awareness campaign that has to be done. Firstly, that the public doesn't panic, that they don't get the feeling that immediately there will be a huge outbreak. But then also awareness of symptoms, awareness of people that have traveled to China, and if they have any indication that they are ill, that they present themselves to a health worker. And then also basic hygiene messages, washing of hands, coughing and sneezing into the elbow, preparing food, etc. These reagents have been distributing to countries. WHO and other partners have been working on this. There are different protocols that are being used. So currently there are approximately 200 tests available now in Kenya. You would probably need about 3 tests per person, so maybe 60 or so people can be tested in Kenya. But WHO is resupplying, so there are additional tests that are coming in. What is very important initially is that even the negative tests get verified. So from the first couple of people that are tested, even the tests that are done in country get verified by a reference laboratory, either South Africa or in Europe or even in China. From what it sounds and from what WHO is saying and our Director General is saying, it sounds as if China reacted very speedily and very transparently to this outbreak, and that has been very much welcomed by the international community and by WHO. So this is not a time for discrimination, it's really a time for solidarity. So there's no sense and no benefit really in discriminating to people that look Chinese or that are Chinese, that are outside in the world, because the risk is zero, really zero for these people. So there's absolutely no sense in discrimination at all.
And turning to other news now, Australia says it's finally brought the country's lengthy bushfire crisis to an end. Firefighters in the hardest hit state of New South Wales said fresh rainfall had helped extinguish the blazes that had burned along the east coast since September. Meanwhile, firefighters near the capital Canberra are still trying to bring one fire under control, but they say it's not threatening. The fire scorched more than 10 million hectares in the country's east and south, destroying homes and killing 33 people and an estimated 1 billion animals. Well, time now for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. South Sudan's president welcomes public views on how to resolve boundaries stalemate with the opposition. And from Kenya, an inspiring story of a man who rose from being a cleaner to a surgeon.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The decision to hand over former Sudanese leader Omar al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court has not been finalized. That's according to one of Bashir's lawyers, who on Wednesday said the extradition must first be reviewed by the country's top governing bodies. Bashir has long been wanted by the ICC for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in connection to the Darfur conflict. A day earlier, Sudan's information minister said the government and rebel leaders agreed that those wanted by the ICC should appear before the tribunal. Bashir was not explicitly mentioned by name, but the minister said the decision applied to all 5 Sudanese suspects. Meanwhile, Bashir's lawyer said the ousted leader refuses to deal with the ICC, labeling it a political court.
We refuse to extradite Omar al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court, as it is not a place of justice, but a political European court that was founded to try African leaders, and the African Union has previously rejected this court. We completely reject this decision and consider that the trial of any Sudanese be done on Sudanese soil, and never before has any Sudanese been tried outside of Sudan. We do not consider that this decision is complete because it must first pass through all institutions, including the armed forces. The president has been the supreme leader of the armed forces all these years, and he represents them and has fought with them. All the groups which were recently formed oppose his rule, and now these groups want to see him on trial. If there were crimes, then any trial must go forth to Sudanese courts, where justice will be served reasonably.
And we head to the Horn of Africa now, where tensions have been rising along the border between Somalia and Kenya. This follows a daring escape by a minister in the state government of Jubaland from jail in Mogadishu. The southern-based Jubaland government is backed by Kenya. CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo takes a closer look at the standoff.
Kenyan troops secure a strategic bridge linking the town of Bardere and Belet-Hawo along the border between Somalia and Kenya. In recent weeks, the Somali government has mobilized thousands of troops along the border region, taking over several towns from Jubaland troops, a regional administration strongly backed by Kenya. The standoff was triggered last month after Jubaland Security Minister Abdurrashid Hassan Abdul Noor escaped custody in Mogadishu, fleeing to Kenya before returning to the Gedo region. Police in Somalia have issued an international arrest warrant against the minister, accusing him of committing human rights violations, while urging Nairobi to hand over the fugitive minister to face justice.
Bulahawa is a strategic district and a border town between Somalia, Kenya and Ethiopia. It is unfortunate that we now have Ethiopian and Kenyan troops siding with two different forces. It is a big setback for conflict to arise in a region that has been stable for all these years. Jubaland forces have been in charge, and it should remain like that. Stabilizing Gedo is critical in regional security.
Kenyan military serving under the African Union peacekeeping force AMISOM maintains several bases in the region, with some coming under heavy attack from the group in the past. Analysts say that the new conflict between government forces will embolden Al-Shabaab, giving it space to increase attacks in Somalia and across the border.
Al-Shabaab is the biggest winner in this conflict. We have seen the attacks in northeastern Kenya, attacks on schools and teachers, and cases of Al-Shabaab killing people because they are Christians. The government should invest its might on dislodging militants in the border region instead of what is happening now.
Since last year, the federal government of Somalia has maintained its opposition to the re-election of Ahmed Mohamed Islam as the Jubaland leader. Instead, it has called for fresh elections in the region, one that it will closely supervise. U.S. Ambassador to Somalia Donald Yamamoto has been in Kismayo for talks with the regional leadership, a move analysts say is aimed at maintaining regional security. Washington supports regional forces in Jubaland in their fight against Al-Shabaab. For now, experts say it remains to be seen how the standoff in the Gedo region will be handled and to ensure that the fight against Al-Shabaab remains the government's top priority. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
South Sudan's President Salva Kiir says he is open to receiving suggestions from the public on the contentious issue of the number and boundaries of states in the country. President Kiir is expected to return to Ethiopia to meet with opposition leader and designated Vice President Riek Machar on Saturday. CGTN's Patrick Oyet reports from Juba.
It is just over a week to the scheduled formation of a unity government in South Sudan, but there still isn't an agreement between the former conflicting parties on how many states the country will have during the transitional period. The number and boundaries of administrative units remains unresolved.
We've had a very serious fight or disagreement with the opposition groups. It's been very tough. You know, in the military, when a fight is tough, you make a brief tactical withdrawal. That's why we're here, to hear your views.
The opposition group led by Riek Machar wants the number of states reduced to between 10 and 23. It says more states will allow President Kiir to give many government jobs to loyalists in return for votes at elections scheduled for the end of the transitional period. President Kiir's government wants to maintain the current 32 states, saying it takes services closer to people. In Juba, residents hope the issue can be resolved.
The issue of a state is not our problem, and it is not our challenges. As a citizen of the Republic of South Sudan, if we had a peace in the country, then the issue of the state will be solved as a normal thing.
This issue is our own issue. We will iron them out. And we want more states, not even 32 states plus a year.
The new government in South Sudan is scheduled to be formed by February 22nd. President Salva Kiir's group insists there will be no more extension of the period for formation of the unity government, but in reality, there must be an agreement with opposition groups on a way forward before forming that government. Time for reaching the agreement is running out. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
An inspiring story from here in Kenya now. Patrick Kibe has worked as a cleaner, a storekeeper, a nurse and a clinical officer at Kijabe Hospital, located about 60 kilometers north of Nairobi. Thanks to his commitment and dedication, he's now a certified cataract surgeon who performs different eye procedures in the hospital. His journey to becoming an eye specialist started in 1993 when he enrolled for a nursing course as he worked in the hospital store. CGTN's Wilkista Nyabwa has that story.
The narrow beam of light illuminates the problem. The patient has cataract and they are blurring her vision, but she has come to the right person. Patrick Kibe has spent 3 decades preparing for patients like her, and his experience shows as he explains the intervention that is needed and the possible outcomes. When Patrick first arrived at AIC Kijabe Mission Hospital in 1990, he had no plans of entering the medical field.
I was coming to Moffat Bible School, which is just outside, just next year to Kijabe, and I was coming to be a pastor.
But the interviewing panel thought he was too young. He was offered a different role.
So I came, and then I was employed as a cashier laborer in Kijabe. The work that I was given was to be cleaning in Salome ward, that's the current female ward, Wairi Salome, and Wairegi ward, that's the male ward.
Then he moved to the supplies department. After a year, he enrolled in nursing school and was sent to a remote area to start a clinic. That set Patrick on the path that has become his lifelong mission.
I realized that many people in Kajiado, they had eye issues. Then I saw that the way that I can be able to help this, I need to go to school.
First, he upgraded his nursing certificate to a diploma. Then he studied clinical medicine and afterwards specialized as an ophthalmic clinical officer and cataract surgeon. He also has a Bachelor of Science in Medical Education and has studied laser therapy. And as he rises, he's mentoring other colleagues to follow in his footsteps.
Doctor seeing how he is ambitious and we have been talking together, I also started my master's, which I'm finishing. So I can say Patrick has been a mentor.
The eye clinic Patrick set up at the hospital has grown to offer services to diabetic patients. Cataracts are the leading source of blindness in Kenya, contributing to over 40% of cases. Through the years, other facilities have tried to lure the eye surgeon away, to no avail. His mission, he insists, is to serve those who wouldn't otherwise afford his services.
One of the things which actually encourages me is seeing a blind patient, a patient with cataract coming helpless, and then we help that person. I operate on that person, and that person leaves Kijabe saying, yes, I can see again.
The eye surgeon is now working on his Masters of Science in Medical Education so that he can inspire the next generation. How Patrick planned it when he first arrived in Kijabe. However, after years of sheer grit and hard work, he is now able to fulfill his vision through restoring the sight of others. Wilkista Nyabwa, CGTN at Kijabe Mission Hospital in Kijabe.
The UN Refugee Agency has expressed concern about the worsening humanitarian situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The UNHCR says rebel attacks in Beni territory have forced more than 1,000 civilians to flee their homes over the past 2 months. CGTN's Chris Ochamringa has more.
UNHCR staff say attacks by militia groups in the eastern territory of Beni have displaced more than 1,000 women, men and children. Many of them had just returned to their villages after fleeing violence in April last year. The displaced families are now being sheltered by host communities in Nobili town, but they are in dire need of assistance. Local authorities have blamed the attacks against civilians on rebels of the Allied Democratic Forces. The Islamist rebel group is accused of killing more than 300 civilians in eastern DRC since last October. The Congolese army launched a military offensive against them last year, but the killings have continued to happen. Eastern DRC is a mineral-rich area that has been racked by conflict for more than 2 decades. Chris Ochamringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Well, now time for your business news with Roman Young.
Thank you very much, Lindy. Here's what's coming up in business. Oil demand to fall for the first time since 2009 due to the coronavirus outbreak. And we'll explore why fuel shortages are forcing motorists in Sudan to skip work in order to queue for petrol.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Now, within the course of this hour, and hopefully the next one, the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa should start delivering his State of the Nation address in Parliament buildings in Cape Town. Now, this essentially does mark the start of the year's parliamentary program, and it comes against the background of an economy in crisis. Unemployment in the country is at 29%, and there's several dysfunctional state-owned enterprises like Eskom and SAA, which are draining limited tax resources. We'll have details on that as it does happen. Now, elsewhere, oil demand is set to fall this quarter for the first time since the financial crisis in 2009. And that primarily is due to the coronavirus outbreak, or as it's now been formally named, COVID-19. The International Energy Agency says in its latest forecast that demand for the period to March, the first quarter of the year, is expected to fall by over 430,000 barrels a day compared to last year. In the second quarter, the IEA is expecting oil demand to grow by about 1.2 million barrels a day before normalizing in the third quarter with growth of about 1.5 million barrels a day, and the likely economic stimulus measures that might come out of the world's second largest economy. It is, however, forecasting a fall in demand for oil produced by OPEC, while output growth by American companies might not be affected until later in the year. Mobile World Congress, the annual telecoms industry gathering that draws in at least 100,000 visitors to Barcelona, has been cancelled. Organisers made that announcement on the 13th of February after a mass exodus by exhibitors due to fears over the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, the announcement follows a crisis meeting of the GSMA board after its hand was essentially forced really by the pullout of anchor European members, including Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone, BT and Nokia. Now, assurances from local and national health officials that the event would be safe did very little, it seems, to win the confidence of the exhibitors. The event had been scheduled to run from the 24th to the 27th of February. Now, this COVID-19 epidemic has attracted the attention of South African economists as well. Anthony Black is a professor of economics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He's concerned about the impact of this outbreak on African economies.
Africa and the rest of Africa export mainly commodities to China and import consumer goods, electronics, lots of manufactured goods. So if we take South Africa first, I mean, China is our biggest trade partner, so it is very significant, and this could affect, I mean, if the Chinese economy slows down, that will affect commodity exports and probably global commodity prices negatively. I don't think that there are going to be any sort of lasting effects. Having said, you know, that does depend on what happens with the virus, but this virus is here. Hopefully it then sort of fades down, and then you will see kind of normal commerce being resumed. I don't expect that there are going to be long-term effects on patterns of trade resulting from this. If the virus de-escalates and the problem de-escalates, then you would expect the economy to bounce back quite quickly, because there'll be consumption which has been delayed and people staying at home so they haven't been out shopping, all those kinds of things, and there'll be factories making up lost time. So you'd expect a kind of mini boom to happen.
Now, there's a human dimension to this story as well. Florent, a Rwandan businessman, has quite a few business dealings in China. His son is also studying in Changsha. Now, they're both affected by this COVID-19 outbreak. While his son has recently come back from China, Florent is hoping that the epidemic will be contained soon so that his son can continue his studies. He says there's quite a bit that Rwanda can learn from this particular event.
Unfortunately, coronavirus was a bad news to me. The beginning of January, I was in China. I did some agreement with a Chinese businessman, thinking that after the new Chinese year, we was going to make it effective. I was supposed to go back to China in Feb, 5 Feb. So I had to cancel my ticket. That disease, we hope it can go off very quickly. China is the fastest growing country, and I saw China as the future of the world. I do appreciate the way they work, and not only the way they work, I also like the way they behave, you know, the culture. My son, like as a heritage, I want him to be involved in that development. If you go to China, he knows how they make roads, you see, he knows how to make those buildings. That's the things which inspired me.
Now, on to North Africa. Tunisia's central bank has proposed a foreign exchange amnesty as part of a broader set of efforts to increase foreign currency holdings in the country. Now, theoretically, this operation could provide hundreds of millions of dollars to the state.
The central bank proposed, as part of its general guidelines on the review of exchange legislation, to work with the various structures concerned, so as to gradually lift exchange restrictions that hinder some transactions with foreign countries for institutions and individuals.
This is an important project because it will provide additional resources to the state fund. There are millions in foreign exchange circulating in the parallel market and abroad. The state, as well as thousands of Tunisians, will benefit from the amnesty.
The central bank is also planning to bring about some changes aimed at completing the liberalization of current operations to introduce more flexibility and transparency in the exchange regulations.
The review of the exchange law, which requires the amendment of Law Number 18 of 1976 and the implementing texts, is mainly linked to the Tunisian state policy in this area. The central bank aims to implement more transparency.
The Finance Committee at the Tunisian Parliament has rejected the proposal and urged the government to introduce a new bill.
The Tunisian parliament is not willing to encourage tax evasion and to legalize the situation of people who made millions in illegal ways. The central bank wants to give incentives to some businessmen who do not deserve it. We will back any project that favors real transparency.
According to the central bank governor, the amnesty covers investments by non-resident foreigners in Tunisia, such as the publication of Circular Number 14 of 2018 on the digitization of the investment form as a bank document allowing non-resident investors to benefit from the transfer guarantee. Regarding transfers abroad made by Tunisian institutions for foreign investment, the maximum amount was set at $1 million when financing with the business account in foreign exchange for exporting companies. Tunisia's foreign currency assets reached nearly $7 billion, which corresponds to 115 days of imports. Aden Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Now, fuel shortages have left motorists in Sudan skipping work just in order to queue for a chance to get some fuel. The crisis has forced the country's transitional government to introduce a rationing system as it tries to manage a pretty acute economic crisis. Here's Alexandra Majala with the details.
Some people in Sudan have been spending entire days in queues that stretch for several kilometers since the fuel crisis began late last week. Coming on top of bread shortages, it has piled more pressure on a government struggling to deliver improvements after former President Omar al-Bashir was ousted last April.
Petrol, oil, bread and gas are all essential and must be made available to the people. I've been here in the petrol queue since 9 a.m. and I'm not even close to the gas station, and now it's 4:30 p.m. and there is a possibility I'll be here until 5 or 5:30. So from 9 a.m. to 5 or 5:30 p.m. to fill up, and there is a possibility they tell me that they've run out.
I go from the bread queue to the petrol queue, and from the petrol queue to the gas queue. Our lives are spent going from one queue to the other.
The government is working under a 3-year power-sharing deal between the military and civilians. It is also battling with a legacy of decades of economic sanctions and mismanagement that hampered infrastructure development and investment. The transitional body has inherited a generous subsidy system under which petrol costs just about 12 US cents at official rates or 6 cents at black market rates per litre.
We have decided that distribution of petrol to privately owned vehicles will be at a value of 120 Sudanese pounds each time. We have also decided to divide the days in which cars fill up their tanks to specific days for owners of license plates with odd numbers and specific days for owners of cars with even numbers.
They say the current fuel shortage is caused by a broken refinery pipeline that they are working to fix, although it's unclear how long this will take. Though there have been occasional fuel shortages before and after last year's uprising, some motorists say the current one is the worst yet. Taxis are hard to find and drivers have sharply raised their prices to compensate for the time they spend queuing for fuel. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
All right, then, this next story had quite a few people raising their eyebrows. The oil major BP says it wants to change profoundly in order to dramatically cut its carbon emissions in the next 30 years. That's according to its current CEO, Bernard Looney. Now, the cuts he is proposing represent, at least on paper, one of the oil sector's most ambitious targets. It also forms part of the biggest overhaul in the company's 111-year history. Now, investor groups, some of them at least, did welcome this 2050 targets, but environmental campaigners are a lot more skeptical. They criticized the lack of concrete detail on how these targets would be met. To be clear, BP did not say how it intended to get emissions from its operations and its barrels produced down to net zero, as well as half the intensity of emissions run across all the products that it does sell. On paper, though, the goal does put BP ahead of its rivals like Royal Dutch Shell, Total, and pretty much all of the US oil majors.
The world does have a carbon budget. It is finite, and it is running out fast. And we need a rapid transition to net zero. Society has got to deliver on the Paris goals. Our ambition is to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world get to net zero.
Keep this.
Aim number one is to be net zero across our entire operations on an absolute basis by 2050 or sooner. Aim number two is to be net zero on an absolute basis across the carbon content of our upstream oil and gas production by 2050 or sooner. Very important.
Now then, I'll leave it there for the time being, but I'll be back at the top of the hour. We'll be looking at some takeaways from the State of the Nation address from the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, assuming he actually does get round to it. At the moment, the speech has essentially been blockaded, as it were, by members of the Economic Freedom Fighters Party. He was supposed to start at the top of the hour, hasn't happened just yet, but we're keeping an eye on that, and we'll bring you all the highlights when it does happen. For now, back to Lindy.
Thanks, Rama. Well, time for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on Africa Live. Coming up on World Radio Day, we take you to Ghana, where radio still rules despite the growth of social media platforms.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival, and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Thursday marks World Radio Day. In Ghana, many continue to rely on radio as their main source of information and entertainment. Despite the popularity of social media platforms, radio still reaches the widest audience. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai tells us more.
Esi Amankwa tunes into the radio every day. It allows her to stay in touch with current affairs and keeps her entertained as she sells her food.
I enjoy listening to radio. It keeps me informed about things happening in the country.
Esi is one of many Ghanaians that will rely on the radio for credible news and information when the country goes to the polls in December. For that reason, the United Nations marks World Radio Day every year to raise awareness among the public of the importance of the medium. Evans Mensah has practiced radio journalism for 15 years. He says the information distributed on air is crucial for maintaining peace in the country. That's even more true during general elections.
Our ability to protect the gate from comments and, contributions and other, broadcast items that could inflame passions even further is one of the key things that we guard against. And so this particular year, like other years, what we've done is to develop very strict protocols to guide who gets onto radio.
Although information circulates quickly through social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, radio broadcasters say their work is still relevant.
Ghana has more than 390 radio stations. Radio remains important here because it reaches the widest audience with information and entertainment and is accessible to those in remote areas that don't have internet or a television.
Communication analysts are concerned about the surge of fake news on social media. Ahead of Ghana's elections, they say even radio isn't immune to the problem.
It has become even more burdensome or crucial for radio stations, especially because of the power that they wield to verify information before going out there on air to put it out.
For many Ghanaians like Esi Amankwa, radio helps shape their lives and guides their opinions on issues affecting the country. They want to trust that the information they get from radio is always accurate and reliable. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
And coming up in your sports news, up next. South African football giants Kaizer Chiefs to challenge their FIFA transfer suspension.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
In your sports news,